Okay, good evening everybody and welcome to this meeting of the Housing and Community Safety Policy and Scrutiny Committee, which is the last meeting of this committee in this municipal cycle. So I'll begin by asking for any declarations of interest from members. No? Okay, thank you. Agenda item 2, the minutes of the meeting, additional meeting that was held on the 23rd of January 2023. Are there any matters of accuracy in the minutes from anyone? No. I had just one thing on a sort of a matter arising on page 3, Roman numeral 3, data surrounding the levels of domestic abuse be shared with the committee. I think we did receive, I don't know whether it was via you, Margot, from Ian Cunningham. No, I'm sure I should have checked before I came, but I'm sure we did receive an update from Ian Cunningham.
We did, Chair.
But I will double check after the meeting, and if we haven't received it, I shall ask for it. Councillor Fitzpatrick.
I mean, not to be audited now, but I do feel that the comments I made about the ASB situation in York, and particularly in the Markham Crescent area, events that happened, I think I did make those points a bit more forcefully than is described there in the minutes. But you know, we'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, and I think the obviously the web recording is there for posterity, so that's the verbatim record. But no, thank you for raising that. Are there any other matters arising or points of accuracy in the minutes?
No.
No. Okay. If not, I will sign the minutes. Thank you very much. Agenda item 3, public participation. We have no registered speakers for today's meeting. This moves us swiftly on to agenda item 4, finance and performance monitor Q3. So, Patrick, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So this is the Q3 update, incorporates data that to December 2022. It was reported to executive on the 9th of February. But we've basically been going through this, we've been reporting the same issues throughout the year. The housing services have been particularly hit by inflationary costs. Within general fund, we do have a couple of hostels, so we've had to face additional running costs, the utility costs in those hostels. The anticipation is within general fund that we can offset that through vacancies that we've had within the general fund area, and also from additional grant income that we've been able to utilise. So the anticipation is that general fund will be within budget. A much greater pressure we've been reporting through the HRA for the year. The 3 main areas that there's pressures are additional costs of repairs and maintenance. So materials are costing more, the pay increases for the workforce were greater than was budgeted, and also any subcontractors that we're using, there's additional costs coming through from those. So we're reporting a pressure of about £600,000 for the year, and we're confident that it's going to be within that ballpark at the end of the year. There's been obviously very significant additional costs in energy, so there are a number of costs that the HRA picks up around communal heating in the sheltered properties, also the heating networks at some of those areas, as well as the lighting in flats and corridors and so on and so forth. The slight rate positive I can report is that we've obviously got a lot more bills coming through this year, and the pressure we're reporting has come down by about 250,000 compared to last quarter. Some of that is also due to the support that we have received from the energy price guarantee, particularly relating to gas, where about 9p per therm has been credited to the council's bills on gas, which means it's only a sort of 400% increase in gas rather than it could have been 600% increase in gas. So it's a ray of good news rather than it being a particular positive. The other shortfall across the HRA has been reduction in income. That's primarily again due to a number of voids and a couple of key properties which are vacant at the moment, where we're about to undertake some significant capital works. So Glen Lodge, Bell Farm, there we will be hopefully delivering those projects in the next year, which takes the pressure away from rents, but we do need to get them filled because that's lost income and lost opportunity for tenants to be in there. If you exclude the carry forward that we did last year on revenue contributions to capital, the HRA is about breaking even this year. It was meant to be, or it was forecast to be, a £2 million surplus. So that's the sort of shock that the HRA has hit. As part of the budget proposals last month, rents will be increasing by 7% next year. That's going to mitigate some of those costs, but it's still going to be a difficult year for the HRA going forward. A lot of it is depending on how inflation carries on, and particularly around the energy side. So that's just something which we're going to have to keep a close eye on going forward. From paragraph 13 onwards, there's the usual updates in performance. More than happy for Michael, Tracy and Dan behind to answer any questions in those particular areas if we can.
Thank you very much. So if we start with any questions members have on the from paragraphs 1 to 12 for Patrick, any questions on the finances? Then we'll move on. Councillor Wells.
Thank you, Chair. It says that voids remain high. Do we have figures for that?
The first time in a long time, our voids are now under 100. So I don't have an exact number. I was just told.
Paragraph 24 says they're 85.
Oh.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's a figure that changes every day. But at the time of writing, they're 85.
You can, yeah.
It says that a third of the properties are long-term voids because they're waiting large-scale capital works, and they're expected to take place in 23-24. Has this been costed? And because I was just looking at the rest of it with the rising labour costs, rising materials and everything, and so are we putting something off till next year that maybe should have been done this year, and then maybe it won't get done next year? It might have to be put off again because of the pricing.
Yeah, so those projects that it's referring to are Glen Lodge and Bell Farm. So Glen Lodge, the old building, requires significant work associated with water hygiene and fire risk. Bell Farm, there's some extensions on the back of the buildings which contain significant amount of asbestos, which is starting to break down. So the plan is to knock those down and to rebuild a replacement extension on the back. So they are significant projects with complexity around moving out existing residents, design work. The Bell Farm pods need planning permission. So there's a significant amount of work required. What we've got approval from executive to do is to undertake that initial work. So we've done lots of surveys, we've procured a design team, and our commitment to executive is that we'll go back with a financial business case once we're in a position to accurately estimate the budget. We've given a high level estimate last year, but we'll be going back with approval for a budget once the next administration is in place.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's got a question on end of paragraph 5. refers to pressures arising from increased energy costs and the two general fund hostels, but that can be in part offset through savings arising from staffing vacancies. So I just wondered in what areas of the business those vacancies were concentrated, or if they're just posts that have become vacant, but there's been a conscious delay in filling them in order to help alleviate the immediate financial pressures, and also what the anticipated impacts will be of keeping some of those posts vacant.
Yes, most of the posts have actually been within the housing options team, and then it's not that they've been deliberately held vacant from a financial perspective. The fact that they have been vacant has allowed us to underspend, but it's been more a case of being difficult to appoint rather than okay. And so there has been a use of some form of agency staff, but it has been lower than otherwise would be the case.
Yeah.
And we have faced difficulties in recruiting across all teams during the course of this year, which will have contributed to that. Some of which has been addressed now in your housing management team. But for instance, in building services, we're still carrying a vacancy at head of service level. We've only just recruited to one of the next levels in management. So it's the problem which I think a lot of businesses and a lot of organisations are facing, in that difficulty in recruiting into roles, the kind of lack of eligible candidates. Okay,
no, thanks for that clarification. Councillor Bassey.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, when I was looking through this, the thing that really leapt out at me, and I'm sure it's depressing for all of us, and I'm sorry I was a little bit late, you've covered it, I think, before I got here, was this significant increase in the costs of repairs and materials that are associated with that. And it got me thinking and just checking what was happening to the cost of materials. And I understand from looking at various media sources that there is a hope that the increase in materials cost is beginning to fall now on things like wood and other materials. But then it also then led me thinking about in 2008, and this is where I think corporate memory loss can kind of cut in. This council signed up to Procure Plus, a sustainable procurement strategy. And I think that's gone now from everyone's imagination. But it got me thinking about, to what degree do we use joint procurement as a device, for example, with other local authorities, to try and control those costs that exist in housing? Because presumably those same costs impact on all local authorities. And well, then there's another point, but it would be good to have to hear how that works in York.
I think I probably wrote the sustainable procurement strategy back in 2008 in a different incarnation, and it is embedded in our regular daily practice around procurement. So the ways in which you can actually achieve that are very much part of our ongoing strategies. The role that joint procurements play in that has always been a bit difficult, because it's the alignment of your re-procurement timescales that enables you to do that, and a similarity in your business model to make sure that you're procuring the same thing and that you can actually go to market in a way that makes sense to the market and delivers benefit to both. We do some work with the university on building services. We've got a kind of shared contract with Jewson's, our provider of all of our building materials. So on the local level, we're trying to make that work in York. It's not always easy. And then the extent to which volume makes a differential in cost at the moment, when costs you can buy as many of you like, it's still going to be more expensive than they were last year. So I think that's the reality of the situation at the moment.
I think before you yes, supplementary,
there was just a supplementary to that, which was, do you see going forward the whole devolution process opening up opportunities in terms of this kind of procurement of raw materials in building and construction to help manage costs, or do you think that's going to be a difficult thing to do?
I think that's a huge challenge for North Yorkshire in putting their all of their housing stock together. They've got 3 HRAs within North Yorkshire. Not all of the authorities hold their own stock, or a lot of that is within registered providers. but it will certainly give us a stronger strategic footing to explore some of these issues. And both Dan and Michael and myself are starting to engage in those fora of considering future strategy and how to align it, both at the kind of your ambitions level, but also how do you get there and what are some of the opportunities. So I think, yes, in short, devolution should bring us some opportunities, but I don't think they're going to be quick or easy, because there's huge practical challenges, I think, for North Yorkshire, even in the basics of combining 3 different HRAs. It's going to be a while before they're in a position to be able to be a little bit more strategic about it, I think.
Yeah, just to briefly add, the area where we have done a little bit of that is around retrofit. That's partly been because we have been the lead partner on the delivery of programmes, and we've procured a contractor that's delivered across regions, where we've been the conduit for the grant funding, and then we've delivered wider. There's conversations with North Yorkshire about continuing that, but the challenge is, I think we've got greater clarity around our ambition and what we're going to deliver. They're still at earlier stages, so as Tracy said, the kind of timing of them both coming on board at the same time is the biggest challenge around retrofit.
So do you have a supplementary, Councillor Pavlik?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just on that question of procurement. So we have one lead supplier, Jewson's, for our building building equipment. How often does that go back out to the market? And is there a cost-effective marketing exercise that can be done? It's just that sometimes when somebody's supplied the council for a long time, that they don't have necessarily the incentive to be as competitive. So when was the last time it was done? And is it going to be repeated on a, say, annual basis, given that there are these inflationary pressures?
I'm only going to answer it to make it look like I know what I'm talking about here, but we don't procure on a yearly basis. They are multiple year contracts, and the value for money assessments within them are done as a matter of ongoing contract management. We've just completed an audit. We're still agreeing the audit recommendations within it, but it is telling us that on a broad sample of different components that we're buying, we are getting value for money compared to the market. But we do have a regular reprocurement, and that will be on a competitive basis. But maybe you can comment a bit on the timescales.
You definitely do know what you're talking about, Tracy. So just to add a little bit of detail, so that the mechanism within that contract is the 100 products that we buy most regularly. There's a process for checking those costs against what it would be the cost from buying them from other providers. Right. To demonstrate that value for money. So we have a member of staff who specifically works on that kind of value for money within the Jewson's contract. And the early analysis from the audit is that is working. We are achieving competitive purchasing within that contract.
That's good.
But if I can, I'll just add to that, but there's obviously a price inflationary element to that contract, and none of the providers at the moment can avoid the fact that prices have been going up by double-digit inflation in a number of areas. So that you can buy as well as you possibly can, but prices are still going up.
Oh, nobody's disputing that the prices are going up overall. It's just that as a major contractor ordering a great deal of stock, it's worthwhile just constantly reviewing that. So it's good to know, Michael, that that exercise is done on a regular and ongoing basis. I've got some other questions, but I'm happy to.
I'll come back to Councillor Vassey. I think you had another substantive, then I'll come back to you.
Thank you. There's just one other question. It was just something that came up again, as I said, while I was considering all of this. I then did a bit of homework and to try and understand risk and insurance in this field, and I can't pretend to know very much more than I started. But what did pop up was a paper on the way that government doesn't insure against risk because it buys in such vast quantities that it doesn't care. I think was it, I'm generalizing this, paraphrasing, but that local authorities do insure against risk and do so where they do so as individual authorities. And then it posited the move that was kickstarted in 2018 to try and develop local government mutuals to try and help to manage risks in areas including this, if I understood correctly. So it's just wanting to have a bit more of a grip on how this local authority does or does not find it possible to manage against these kinds of events that we've been seeing over the past 2 years, or if we don't and we simply have to cope with what faces us.
I will not pretend to be an expert on insurance, and that's probably going beyond the scope of the expertise of this committee, but it is a very, very limited insurance market for local authorities. We went out to tender 2 years ago, and I believe we only got one company who was interested, and they tend to mop up the market for most local authorities. We do have a policy where we self-insure for large elements of it, but ultimately some of the costs are so great we do have to have that protection of insurance from third parties because the liabilities will be so great. What we've noticed as part of the sort of reinsurance, the costs have gone up, but where we did notice that costs have gone up more significantly than any other area was the fire risk, and across all our buildings, whether that be council properties, schools, administrative buildings. So the insurance market is obviously seeing that. I think it's as much the costs of replacing have gone up significantly because of inflation and so on and so forth, and that has led to the additional premiums certainly that we're seeing coming through in the HRA.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Pandit.
So just to delve back into issues relating to pressures on building services in particular and repairs. You're holding vacancies. Well, you're not holding vacancies. You aren't able to fill 2 vacancies. How many contractors short, specialist woodworkers, plumbers, gas fitters, etc. Are we actually short?
We're pretty much at full complement in terms of the trades team at the moment.
So the trades team it's the management areas that you're
yeah, there has been challenges. There has been significant vacancies in the last 12 months during certain periods, but at the moment, through massive effort from the team, we're pretty much at full complement on trades.
So
as of now,
right,
but it's a much more. I guess it's a market now where staff come and go more regularly than perhaps they would have done 5 years ago.
Yeah, because people can pick and choose. Yeah,
there's more opportunity for tradespeople.
So, given that you're now at complement, what's that going to mean for things like those long-term voids, tenant's choice? What's happening in respect of people with new kitchens, new bathrooms, and sort of routine maintenance? Are you able to be more responsive or responsive more quickly?
Sorry, but just a bit of context there that our directly employed staff are a portion of our workforce. The rest of those services are commissioned from specialist providers. So something like the tenant's choice work, the refitting of kitchens and bathrooms is done through a commissioned contract with a specialist. Same for windows and doors. So just looking at whether or not we're fully staff doesn't necessarily give you the sum total of the resources that can be applied. And we have we're just wrapping up a process of re-procurement of a lot of those major contracts, which will give us greater bandwidth to be able to be responsive and plan. But we have a limited amount of money we spend in a year, so that's the other kind of constraint on the bandwidth of our ability to be responsive. And there's always that balance between planned maintenance, where you decide on how you're going to avoid a long-term reactive repairs, and the stuff that still needs doing on a reactive basis. So it's a very complex business, and there's no kind of easy answer between just being fully staffed and it being therefore easy to be more responsive.
We've got tenant's choice, I think, is picked up.
Yes, in the later
items.
agenda items, yeah.
Anything else on the Q3 monitor?
Just these housing completions, the additional houses, where we had 337 net housing completions, of which 232 were student flats. So does that mean that we've got 107 housing completions non-student, or do those include other student flats? See, this is where it gets complicated, because we have to count student accommodation within the overall housing delivery element, when in reality that is only that's not suitable for the vast majority of residents of York. It's trying to get a sense of what are we actually building and what we're actually seeing to help with the housing crisis in York.
This is paragraph 18.
Yes, sorry, yes.
232.
Page 9, paragraph 18, yeah.
So I read that as 107 non-student.
Yeah, that's how I read it. Yeah. I just wanted to check.
Okay. Is that reading correct?
That's certainly my understanding. Apologies, it says the word competed. It does mean completed.
Complete. Yeah.
But yeah, it's as you say, they're the houses that have been completed on that are not part of student accommodations.
Right. Cool.
Okay. Thank you. This final question from me on paragraph 25. The reference to a large-scale stock survey appraisal exercise. I just wondered what was meant by large scale. Is that all of the properties, or a sort of significant proportion? I just wondered how that was being profiled as to how that appraisal was being done.
Yeah, so as part of our work in developing the retrofit action plan, we procured Parity Projects, which is a piece of software that extrapolates information that's currently available and applies. It makes assumptions and creates a model for all housing stock. So from that, we've got a good guide around EPC levels for all housing stock within the city. It's not 100% reliable, and before we undertake works, we do an individual assessment of that property to get a fully accurate EPC certificate. But it gives us a much more informed picture of all housing stock in the city than what we had before.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, members, on this item? Councillor Bassley.
Just one, thank you, Chair. Yes, has any modelling been done to consider the impact in a 2 or 3 months' time of the local plan being adopted or not adopted on the kinds of figures that we might be seeing coming through for our applications for completions, the impact of that on the market and city?
Yeah, as part of the local plan work, which once the local plan is agreed, that local plan team will come to me to integrate with our regeneration activity. So I'm starting to kind of ramp up my my understanding of that and my input into it. And as part of that, there is a modelling of what the projections are from each of the strategic sites to about which year they'll be build outs in and what that's likely to mean for the community infrastructure levy, the delivery of those sites and the impact that's likely to have on the city. It's quite a kind of complex picture, but from that you can also extrapolate the affordable housing element of it, which is of concern to us. We are now starting to interface with the developers and the owners of those big strategic sites to look at whether or not we can encourage them and use our soft influence to look at both greater sustainability standards for those houses and potential ways to increase the level of affordable over and above policy. Right, those are big ambitions. But if we don't start early enough, it'll be too late. We need to get in on the ground ahead of master planning activities and well ahead of it coming to planning to be able to kind of influence their thinking.
Thank you.
Can I just
to
respond to that? And I think it would be good when the next council is formed, if that were on the agenda, Chair, as something that this committee could look at in order to understand what opportunities may and may not prevail in the months, so that members are engaged with what you've just described there, Tracy.
I think there's probably a need for an executive report that looks at that issue once the local plan's been agreed, you know, the now what question. So maybe in the run up to that going to executive, it'd be useful to explore that as a scrutiny topic.
Councillor Pavlovic.
I mean, just on that, I think the an analysis of the impact of SIL on affordable housing numbers in particular is one that I think a committee, whether it's executive or a housing scrutiny committee, is it would be really quite useful. You know, I think there are anxieties that SIL will actually reduce the number of affordable because it's going to increase the it's going to really increase the developer contribution, and therefore you get issues of viability. But it would be useful to have an analysis of the impact of SIL on affordable housing supply.
Just to update members, there was a report that went through to the Economy and Place Scrutiny Committee to consider how the SIL would be implemented and how members would their involvement in determining particularly the neighbourhood element of the SIL, how that would actually fit into the capital programme and how members would be involved in that.
To save me having to go through every single agenda for the last 10 months of EMP, if somebody could find where that was and just send us a link through, that would be really useful to see.
I'll do that.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you, Patrick and Tracy and Michael. Obviously, you're free to leave, Patrick, if you need to. Thank you. Or if you want to. Okay, we'll move on to agenda item 5, which is an update on housing capital investment programme and cases of damp and mould. Tracy?
So yeah, this is a very brief introductory paper because we have already discussed this both at a previous scrutiny meeting, but also as part of the housing asset management paper that went to executive in December. But what we've got here is just an update on our progress in delivering that, a copy of the response to the social housing regulator, and then what I've tabled today is a response to further questions we've had back from the regulator. So apologies for late tabling it, but it gives you an entire picture of the situation today. And as we didn't have a future meeting for which to table that secondary response, it's there for your information. And if you have any questions about it outside the meeting, we'd be more than happy to answer those once you've had a chance to read through it. It adds a little bit more depth to the initial response and talks more about the kind of organisational importance of the issue of damp and mould and how that is mainstreamed into our planning and how it's covered in our performance management framework and our governance arrangements. But if there's anything more you want to add on the update, but it's over to questions really.
Okay, members. Councillor Fitzpatrick. Put your microphone.
Just having, not having had it in advance, and I appreciate why, Tracy, I've mentioned that before. It's easy, I find it easier obviously to read it beforehand, but looking at the data and the way data is going to be held in the document here, as part of our improvement journey, that paragraph, second paragraph on the second page, and talking about open housing there and pulling things together. Can data be supplied on the health of the council's stock geographically, e.g. in Town Hall, when of the properties had tenants' choice, windows replaced, etc.? How are decisions taken on where the next prioritised areas are for work to be done, basically? Obviously, there'd be a lot of work, a lot of data, but can that data be made available for us to see, to get an idea where that is geographically around the city?
Yes, so the capital programme is a planned programme. So on open housing, it lists the components, and by components I mean, you know, kitchens, bathrooms, when they were installed, windows. So we have data on when they were done. We have an approved approach that's informed by decent home standards about how often we will replace those things. So we know a year in advance what our priority investments are going to be. So we're pretty close to finalising what our planned works will be for 23-24. So we both know the age of existing components, and therefore when our intention is to deliver a new updated component.
Thank you. So basically then elected members could know in their wards, for example, they would be able to tell where they might stand in terms of where they whether they're going to be dealt with next, prioritisation, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's fine. I think the slight caveat and the slight nervousness is, so we have our capital programme for the year, which is our intent, but things happen, don't they? You know, an apartment block where we assumed we were going to repair the roof, we then have to replace it because we do some more surveys, it starts leaking. So there's a need every year to reprioritise as we go. But you know, a good capital programme informed by good surveying and good data shouldn't shift much within the year. So I'd be nervous about saying a specific house or a specific street too much in advance, but I think we can give good information on the scale, i.e. the number of new kitchens and bathrooms within different wards. The other piece of information to note on that home modernisation bit, which I know is of particular interest, is our ambition for the next couple of years is to mop up a number of properties where residents declined home modernisation during COVID because they didn't want tradespeople within their properties. So our aim is to target those residents, but they again may choose to decline that work, and we're not in control of that. So again, there'll be an element of reprioritisation depending on who accepts and who doesn't accept that offer of work as we offer it around the city.
Yeah.
Just following on from that then, about those types of situations, possibly, does the health of tenants enter into the equation when making any of the kinds of decisions?
It does, yeah. So primarily related to our damp works. So when damp is reported, we go out, we investigate, we do a number of measures that we hope will resolve it. Things like ventilation, checking the heating system works, make sure downpipes are functioning properly. We hope that resolves it. The plan is to then go back, and if it hasn't resolved it, we would undertake a more detailed damp survey that may identify structural issues. As part of that process, we have a as well as looking at the condition of the property, we look at the health circumstances of the residents, so their age profile, their health circumstances, and we triage based on a combination of property condition and the health of the residents.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Just, I suppose, picking up on that. So do we have the ability through the information systems we have to raise sort of flags in terms of particular vulnerabilities that certain tenants might have, or is it more informal, I guess, in terms of how we sort of use and store that information?
No, so we are developing our processes, so we're trying to continue to improve in this area, but we have data stored that highlights the condition of the property and highlights who occupies that property in terms of their age profile. I think in terms of our response to the regulator, our commitment is that we might do a little bit more around underlying health conditions that aren't clear and obvious. No, they're not age related. But I think we need to develop a bit of thinking about exactly how we do that in terms of how we approach that conversation about health conditions.
It can be quite a sensitive.
It's a bit of a data protection minefield in terms of capturing personal data in that way, and how you are then manage the data and how you use it in your decision making. You've got to be really careful.
Yeah, Councillor Pavlik.
I mean, interestingly, the chair and I were just talking about it just before the meeting, and you know, we were both saying that often constituents come to us as ward councillors and saying, you know, I reported this months ago, it still hasn't been done. I've got you know, chronic COPD or and then you ring up and it's, oh, we didn't know that. Oh yes, in that case, yes, we'll definitely send somebody out. And it's I appreciate the data minefield business, but I think there are basic questions that we ought to be asking when somebody reports a fault in. You know, are you in receipt of PIP? Do you get carers allowance? Do you get an attendance allowance? You know, these are questions that I think would help then you be able to inform, rather than just they're 82, you know, because you can be 42 and still have a whole heap of problems, but unless they come to us, they just sit and suffer. And that can't be the right way around. You know, the people who shout loudest or think to get in touch with the councillor actually get their work done at the time that they should have had it done. So I think there is a piece of development work that needs to be done, and it'd be really interesting at, again, some subsequent iteration of this committee, how that type of triaging, prioritization is actually working in practice.
So if you want to respond to that, but it sounds like a working process. But
yeah, we agree.
Yeah, okay. Very good. Just pick up. Sorry, Councillor Craghill. And to put your microphone on.
Very much. Just picking up on that, you're going to talk on the next item about the new HMO system, and there are potentially connections there, I think, aren't there? Because you know, you've got a paragraph that's talking about working more closely across HMOs and local area coordinators and ward councillors, residents associations, public, you know, so linking up all of those things, I think it's definitely, you know, when something in building services, I think it's somewhere else about gas, people asking for their gas to be capped off. That's a real warning sign that should
absolutely
pass across.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's about taking data from as many sources as you possibly can to get a picture for then how you prioritise the work to be done. And, you know, the more information you have, the more accurate that triaging and that analysis is going to be. But, you know, we have a lot of long-suffering residents who don't like to make a fuss and don't like to complain, and consequently sometimes get missed out until something gets so desperate that a family member ends up getting in touch with us, or a neighbour or something like that. You know, which isn't the right way to do it, but you know, it's what we're here for, you know, it's what we're elected to do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, John.
I was just going to say, part of the process we're developing is about regular visits. So I think we hold our hands up that some of the people on particularly the structural damp list have been on there too long, and also they haven't been communicated with as well as they should be. So part of the process that we're developing is that they will receive regular visits, one, to see whether their personal circumstances have changed around health, but secondly, to just check the home in terms of has the condition of that home deteriorated, opportunities for things like clean downs, and I guess checking in and making sure that it remains a suitable place for that person to live, because we do have a significant number of properties, and it is going to take us some time to get through them all.
Making those value judgments about if you're in a property dealing with standing water, for instance. I think our teams have been doing the kind of, well, whilst we're in there, we might as well upgrade XYZ, which has swallowed more of the money and delayed implementation on some of the ones. So I think prioritising this as a specific issue where you go in and you do that piece of work, and then that might not be alongside other work, is definitely the direction of travel.
Yeah, this was leads on to my question around tenant's choice or home modernisation, which we're now calling it. Is that right? I'm sure I read that in an email somewhere, but tenant's choice as was. Because I went to a very sort of informative drop-in session for the Dringhouses residents a while back about sort of their tenant's choice, and I think that's been delayed. And I sort of thought, well, maybe that's, you know, because of the other works that had emerged that were more reactive, that it along the lines of trying to do as much as possible in one visit, or as much work to one property as can be done at the same time. Is it those kind of pressures that sort of delayed the rollout of tenant's choice, or is it more to do with the reprocurement of contractors to make sure we've got the right mix of skills to do some of the not just putting a new bathroom and kitchen, but some of the other things that are in here? Be useful to kind of understand that thinking around that. Yeah.
I think it's both. I think it's that element of balancing priorities within year, and we do have a number of contracts, including home modernisation, which is what our residents have told us they prefer. So that's what we're going to use. What's my train of thought? So we're reprocuring the contractor to deliver that work. So there is a pause between that old contract winding down, where we're not giving new work to that contractor, and the mobilisation of the new contractors in the new financial year.
So there's a little bit of a COVID impact on this one as well, on the home modernisation.
Yeah, I think things got slightly out of kilter because a high proportion of residents turned down the work than they would normally. Yeah. So we got to streets that were further ahead in the programme than we would need to. I think the reassurance I can provide on the home modernisation programme is the stuff that we are replacing is within its life cycle. So our approved approach is that we replace kitchens and bathrooms every 30 years. The stuff that we are lining up for next year is in the kind of 27 to 28 year. So we don't have lots of properties. We don't have any properties apart from those that have turned down works where they've got kitchens and bathrooms that are over 30 years old. I think there is lessons around communication. with the residents involved. But in terms of their properties, they are decent within the kind of classification that's used around kitchens and bathrooms.
That's fine. I think communication with residents and with councillors as well, in terms of just so we know what's going on. Councillor Wells, I think you'd indicated the question.
Yes, it was just going back to something you were saying, and I suppose we'll actually be covering it in the next item. It was, how do you balance going round visiting people with not being nosy? I watched a programme quite a while ago about what it was like to have a council house when they first came up, and you used to get a council manager going in and checking and saying, you've got a lot of that's untidy there, you've got washing not done. And it was just and I know that's not what you're talking about, but it's how do you balance the two?
Yeah, I mean, it's an absolutely valid question. I mean, time, legislation, events have moved on an awful lot since those days. In York, it used to be called lady visitors, that went into people's homes and did the dust test and things like that. It's so far removed from that now. That we have no absolute right of entry into homes anymore, whereas we did before the Housing Act 77, I think it was, which gave secure tenancies to people and the resultant rights attached to those tenancies. We very much go in as an invite from the people who live in our homes, and the despite the noise, I'll continue. And the relationship is very much different, but it's changed over the years, moving very much away from a sort of paternalistic approach from landlord. And I think certainly the culture that we are developing, and I think you see this more and more, is one of being on an equal footing. We're just all people. We work together to try and find solutions with the limited resources that we have and the issues that we face, and that's very much the approach. However, we do have responsibilities as a landlord, and with things like the new regulatory regime that are coming up, those responsibilities are set out very clearly for us, and we have to make sure that in performing all of our duties that we have regard to, not only the condition of the property, but showing respect for the people who live in our homes and having due regard to them. And that's very much a journey that we are on. And I think we do that work successfully. I do encourage staff to be, and we do this across the services, what we call professionally curious, because what we do want is to identify people who do need help, maybe a bit reluctant to get involved with the council or other services, but in a very polite and professional way. I want my teams to be, well, I suppose another word for it is nosy, about people, and making sure that they are happy, healthy, and living comfortably in their homes. And we'll offer help. We certainly won't force and can't force things and services on people. As Michael has pointed out over the years, many people point blank refuse to have modernisation work done on the homes, and we live with that and we cope with that, and we do it when we get the opportunity to do that. So it's a very different environment to them. That's a very anachronistic approach to that. But people do still say to us now, I wish we had those people that came in and told people what to do. It's not going to happen.
No. Not going to do a dust survey.
No. Councillor Fitzpatrick was a follow on. Yeah,
just briefly. I think I've said in previous meetings, I grew up under that system. We had a council house and we did have somebody come round regularly, and that worked. We were all nervous about it, but it worked. And we cleaned for the person who was coming round, basically. I suppose, again, it will come up later, really. It's just the joined up services. They're not being able to go in, whatever, where children are concerned and things like that. There will be some joined up working, won't there, obviously, on that. Homes where there are children. I mean, we need to know if they're at risk or safeguarding and things like that. So that might come into the next section. Yeah.
Hold that thought. I'll bring Councillor Pavlovic in and then Councillor Vassie. Did you have a question?
Thanks. So in this supplementary paper that you've put out, Tracy, and I think we actually got this information from Vicky Japes a couple of meetings ago about the damp and mould. 118 homes with structural damp and mould works identified category 2 cases. One, can you define what a category 2 is as opposed to a category 1? And 2, there's on paragraph 4 of the substantive agenda, there's 1.8 million allocated for standing water, which presumably constitutes a significant part of that 118. Have you had the work costed for remediation on those 118 category 2 properties? So there's about 4 questions in one there.
I do my best, Councillor. Thank you very much. I won't go into all the nuances, but category 1 is the most severe, the most significant, the most likely to have a health impact on the residents. So the HHSRS combines that thing that we were talking about before. It combines the condition of the property with the health of the resident in there, and it puts it into a matrix and churns out a number. So category 1 are the most significant, the most severe, or most like the condition of the property is most likely to have a severe impact on the health of that resident. And then category 2 is a lower category for that. So every time we visit a property that requires structural damp and mould work, we do a reassessment as to whether it remains a healthy place for that resident to live. The vast majority of cases, it is. There has been 1 or 2 examples where we've moved a resident out of that property until we've done damp and mould works.
So they would have fallen into category 1 if you had to move them out?
I think within the classification there would be category 2, but there was perhaps a specific personal circumstance there that meant that we made the decision to move them out.
And that would go back to the points we've just been talking about, health, for example, or children, young children, Yeah. So costing of the remediation work for those properties, which I'm guessing, given the government's focus on damp and mould, which is quite right, are going to be a priority for the authority.
Yeah.
For this coming financial year.
Well, for the next 5 years.
For the next 5 years. So there's a plan to remediate these 818 plus any others that you find within 5 years.
So there every year new properties are getting added. So damp and mould works. Damp and mould can be caused by various factors. Most of the time it's not structural. Where it is structural, things deteriorate on properties at different speeds, and therefore new properties get added to it every time. So it's not that we have 118 to do and then we can dance into the sunset. New properties will come on. So our asset management plan assumes that we will encounter additional structural works required on our properties, so that 118 will keep going up. In terms of whether they are all costed, no, we haven't taken that approach. We do have a survey for each property, so we know the extent of works required. We have been spending, as per Tracy's point previously, a huge amount of money per property. So we've been spending £30,000-40,000 as standard on standing water properties over the last couple of years. We're going through a rigorous review at the moment, and we think that there are ways of resolving the issues that can significantly bring down the cost per unit. the ambition of that is to obviously be able to get through more properties next year than we would otherwise be able to do. So we're working on a new specification, we're procuring new contractors, and we're confident we'll be able to bring the average cost down next year, even in light of the inflationary pressures that we're experiencing. So I can't give you a guarantee of how many of those 118 we'll get through, because it's still work in progress, and we'll see where we get to.
I'm just trying to work out 30,000 into 118. I wasn't even getting close. So
Can I just quickly ask, so you mentioned that 30 to 40,000 per property. Are spending, have spent, will spend? I just wanted to understand what.
So that's what we have been spending, and some of that hasn't been on work specifically associated with the damp and mould. So, you know, if the properties required home modernisation within 5 years of that damp work being done, we've taken the advantage of doing that together. So the intention was good around minimising disruption. So while you're doing major works, do it.
Yeah.
But what that resulted in was getting slightly off kilter with some of the other programmes and creating pressures. So we haven't been able to get through as many properties as we want to. So we're taking a more rigorous approach where we are resolving the immediate issue, the immediate priority as quickly as we can. And those other works, such as home modernisation, will simply fit within the usual cycle that they would do.
So no, good question. So I'm still trying to get a flavour of, if we've got 118 and the number is likely to be increasing, hopefully it will be to a level. You know, if you do 20 and you get 30, it'll go up to 128. You know, as opposed to we're doing none and it just keeps going up and up and up. So what I'm trying to get a flavour of, Michael, is how many of these 118 do you estimate that you're going to do next year? And how are you going to prioritise which ones need doing? And does there need to be additional budget put into it? That's fundamentally the question that I'm asking, but in a very roundabout way.
Yeah, I mean, I normally answer questions, but I think this one I don't want to answer, just because we're in a process of finalising the specification and procuring a contractor. So within a few weeks, we will have prices back from contractors, and we will be able to divide costs by budget, and I'll be able to give you a more informed decision. At the moment, I would be guessing to a large extent. I think we will significantly bring costs down from that 30 to 40,000 pounds. So we will get through them quicker. And I think the number will go down and not up. I think our anticipation is that we will get through more works than new properties getting identified based on what we've seen for the number of new properties that have been added in the last few years.
There's a few context things there just to throw into it. Like, firstly, standing water is not the only kind of cause of damp and mould in houses. And I've made a visit to one of our homes that's due to have some standing waterworks done, and it didn't have a significant mould problem. It can be managed and mitigated, even though you've still got the standing water. They're not all equally bad as each other, if you know what I mean. And the question, your second question about applying more budget to this issue. If we look back at the conversations we had around the asset strategy last time, it is a series of choices about a fixed amount of budget that you've got, and you either spend it on this or on other things. So if you decide that damp and mould is your number one issue, you've really got to keep a very big eye on all the other things that in the past have been priorities, like fire safety, modernisation, retrofit, all those things. That it's a limited pot that can only be spent once, and our objective in our asset strategy is to try and balance those requirements and not just favour one particular subject matter. But that focusing of prioritisation on the impact it's having and the severity of the problem is still your key, whether it's about fire risk or damp and mould. What is the implication of not taking action?
Yeah, and some of the implications of reprioritising budget to damp and mould works would be that you would probably see the number of non-decent homes under the government classification increase. So, there's a requirement to replace components within a time frame, and if you don't do that, that home becomes non-decent. So there's trade-offs and there's balancing and reprioritisation.
Yeah. Did you put your hand up, Patrick? Did you want to say something?
Tracy picked it up
Okay.
exactly.
That's
That
fine.
you can only spend the budget once.
Do you want to?
Yeah,
Well
can I
trained.
Can I just come back though, because this supplementary report actually is really quite helpful. Because yes, I absolutely get that you've got to prioritise against a whole range of issues, but you've mentioned in paragraph 2 on in respect of it's been stapled together. Question 2. The Ombudsman asks that landlords approach a zero tolerance approach to damp and mould. It's almost as though prioritisation is going to be set for you. It's not necessarily going to be in CYC's gift as to where they go with this. So if there's a zero tolerance approach to damp and mould, is a 5-year plan to eliminate damp and mould going to be acceptable?
I think given that we live in a temperate climate, I've made this point before, we live in a temperate climate, damp is something that we live in, we have to deal with in our homes, and it's not going to go away, and there's no amount of money we could throw at this that would stop damp happening forever. We've got limited budgets, and we have to make those prioritisations decisions ourselves, because the housing ombudsman nor the housing regulator are providing any additional finance to be able to resolve these issues. So they can change, you can have a directive from government that this is a #1 priority this week, but if this was a few years ago, it would have been about fire risk safety after Grenfell. So we need to not just follow the news story. We've got to look at all of our responsibilities, which is not to underestimate the importance of damp and mould in people's lives, but it's about the severity that's the issue.
Yeah, and just to add, so the next lines on that paragraph are, this doesn't mean no cases of damp and mould. It means that we're proactive, we understand our stock, so we review it, we survey it, and then we have a plan, an energised and effective plan for dealing with it. I don't think the expectation of the social housing regulator is that there will be no instance of structural damp and mould within any social housing. I think that is an unrealistic expectation given budgets, not just us, but across the country.
I've got Councillor Vassey, but
Yeah, go on.
yeah, Councillor Vassey.
Thank you, Chair. I've got 2 questions. One is a very general one and one more specific. In relation to what's just been said, maybe the more general one to start with. We were invited to respond to a consultation that I think you were producing for government in about November, December. And there are 2 other letters here, or 2 other reports. Is it your gut feeling that government will respond and give more resources to local authorities in the light of all of this work that's been done? Or do you think it'll simply be an invitation that we think clearly about our priorities and deal with it ourselves? Are you anticipating that we might get something from government?
The initial letter from the Secretary of State made it clear that it was our responsibility to sort out the problem. There would be no additional finance.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I'm glad that's out. I'm glad it's out in the open. My second questions relate. We've talked a lot about social housing, and one section in this is about the private rented sector. And I don't think we've covered that as much so far. And I notice a whole lot of stuff in here that's of interest. On the bottom of page 25, the top of 26, there's what's your assessment of the number of private rented sector properties with these kind of problems? And I think the answer is 96, and that represents about 5% of the stock, if I've understood. And then the questions go on to ask about enforcement action. And the figures seem to be about 14 or 15 properties a year. Or in fact, the question there is, first of all, it doesn't actually specify whether these are properties or landlords. On paragraph 28, on page 28, it says provide figures for all formal and informal enforcement action. So one of my questions was, is this enforcement action against a landlord or relating to a particular property, in order to get a sense of how much is being done? It looks like about 15% of those properties that have been identified in the private rental sector are being dealt with every year through enforcement action. So my questions really are about, are we making progress? Do you think that we're on top of this? Is there something that we could be doing more? Or are you broadly happy, given all the constraints we have in terms of budget and whatever, that we're doing okay here and that we're gradually dealing with the problem? Or is there something running away with us? If that makes sense.
I'm guessing we have fewer levers with private rented accommodation, but it'd be interesting to hear what, with the available levers, what we can do and what the government expects us to do.
Yeah, so the numbers relate to numbers of homes, not numbers of landlords. I think in terms of the enforcement action taken, we always work on the basis that enforcement is the last resort, and normally it's about support and advice. So I don't think that these necessarily capture that aspect of the work that we do. So, when we do get a report, we investigate and we speak to the landlord and we encourage them to find solutions, and more often than not, they do. I think when you look at the questions about how many cases of damp and mould do we come across as a percentage of the housing stock in the city, is pretty low. So it's a problem that exists, and it's potentially a growing problem around cost of living crisis, but incidences remain relatively low in the private rented sector.
And the question, can we do more than the introduction of registration of houses in multiple occupation to smaller units will throw more properties into that registration scheme, where we do have greater levers to be able to enforce action.
I was just going to make that point, actually, that's been massively, or will be, moving further along, massively beneficial, because when I've been on the doorsteps, for example, recently, talking to people in HMOs and saying, the additional licensing scheme actually is going to be helpful, because now you will have somebody that you could report these cases into. And they didn't know that the council was, because it was a private landlord, they thought their only recourse was the letting agent or the landlord themselves. They didn't know they could go to the council, to housing standards. So, I've reported a number of cases. I said, right, well, I've got your address, and I've reported it into housing standards for them to go and do a check. But I think with additional licensing and a little bit of work on our part to say, actually, the council can look into, I think you will find that more tenants will actually come and report some of the very poor conditions that they're living in.
Yeah, I suppose looking at the private rented sector of the paper, the thought did occur to me as to whether private rented tenants will be aware of who they can raise concerns with, and potentially be reluctant to raise concerns in case it puts their tenancy at risk. But I suppose all we know is what we know in terms of what's reported.
Yes, if I can follow up, Chair. So going to question 17 on page 27 in relation to what we've been saying here. I just want to make sure I've understood what is the trigger then for the inspections? What is the, are we talking? We've got here, you know, in 2019-20, there were 513 inspections in the private rented sector. I'd just like to understand how those came about.
Yeah, so the majority of them will be linked to our licensing regime.
Right.
So previously all HMOs of 5 or 6 occupants required a license. As of 1st of April, all HMOs with 3 or more occupants will require a license. And the process is you apply
In certain
In certain
certain ones for the smaller ones, but all large for the bigger. But it mops up the vast majority of HMOs because they're quite heavily concentrated in those wards. The process is that a license lasts for a period of 5 years, and we inspect properties within that 5-year period. So again, there's a kind of triage process, a kind of RAG rating, and those with higher risk receive visits earlier in that licensing process. Those that we're more confident will be compliant, receive visits. But yeah, there's basically an annual process of visiting those properties and checking that the information they provided is correct, and therefore the license is valid.
So again, just so I make sure I've understood what you've said, and then I'll, sorry.
No, I just wanted to, in some of the cases will be referred through housing options service as well. So when people approach us for housing advice and homelessness advice around homelessness, private sector tendencies to come to an end, we pick up any of those issues and we'll engage with the team and get inspections done. I've recently been involved in a specific case where our teams have worked together around the condition in the property and preventing somebody's homelessness. So there's a substantial minority of those referrals will come through that. So we're picking it up and linking together.
Thank you, that's interesting. But Councillor Fitzpatrick, unless you
Make sure I've understood. So it's not just homes in multiple occupation we're talking about that get this inspection. It's coming from different sources. Yeah, thank you.
Councillor Fitzpatrick.
I'm just thinking diversity here in the Gypsy traveller community. I know it's up for discussion at the moment as part of the local plan, but it was brought up again this morning in decision session for the executive member for transport about the eviction from the site, one of the sites, and the family have just been living by the side of the road for a long time now. Very unsatisfactory all round. Where do we kind of fit into any of this in terms of ownership of, for example, James Street? Those pitches there have been there a very long time. Those people are not travelling as such. They are on permanent sites. We obviously have data as to who owns them. Are there landlords within the travelling community that rent them out? Do we act as landlords to anybody on the sites? What's the relationship that we have as a council in terms of any things that we're talking about inspections for mould, damp, anything really? It seems to sort of go under the radar a bit.
Who'd like to pick that one up?
On the 3 Gypsy and Traveller sites within York, we are the landlord of the site, the plot. There are some buildings on those sites which are largely about the kind of utilities and toilets and cleaning facilities, which we have. They are our asset to maintain, so they are as much of our responsibility to ensure that they are okay as a council house. The actual caravans and units are the responsibility of the individual occupant, and therefore any damp and mould issues they've got in their own caravan, that's their responsibility. So they are a mainstream element of our asset plan, but they're slightly different because of the nature of the asset.
Mm-hmm.
So the static vans that are on James Street, as opposed to travelling vans, are not owned by the council. They are owned by the actual people themselves who live on those sites.
That's correct. But obviously what we do is we work with people to make sure that they're as happy and as healthy as possible. But yes, that's their own their own property, as it were. But obviously during things like the floods, we intervened as much as we could and supported people where they needed to get new homes, mobile homes. We supported them as much as we could in that. There's a piece of work going on at the moment around improving energy efficiency on the traveller sites as well, and accessing cheaper energy. So there's a discrete piece of work going on about that, with some recommendations and tapping in, hopefully, to some of the energy efficiency money going forward. But that's in the research and options stage at the moment.
Because clearly when an eviction takes place from a site like that, there is nowhere to go. That's the case. And I know it's an individual one, so we won't talk about it now, but yeah, and there are hopes within the local plan to have private sites where the travelling community can own and become landlords within amongst themselves. So that will be developed, hopefully. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions on this agenda item? No, thank you. Thank you very much for that update. So we now move on to agenda item 6, which is the housing management pilot report. Who would like to introduce this? Dennis. Thank you.
Yeah. So again, I will assume that you've read the paper. Very briefly, you will see that we had a previous restructure in 2017, which on the back of a lot of customer feedback meant that we combined a number of different roles. I think you mentioned the income and the tenancy side, but also other roles as well, such as customer services assistants. We combine them into the single role. Our residents very much wanted one person to deal with everything, and that was a response. What we found with the resources that have been available to us over that time, which have been reduced as we've had to make savings across the service, what wasn't quite working, what we wanted to achieve with the structure that we had, wasn't working for the staff, wasn't working for our customers. And we looked at a number of models. We did a lot of consultation with the staff and residents unions, etc. And what we've done is implemented a 3-role model in housing management. One that concentrates on the intensive support at the start of a tenant, before and at the start of a tenancy, to get people set up and on the right footing. A role that is more area-based rather than caseload based, that deals with the sort of, I won't call it run of the mill, but the more routine issues around housing management. So making sure rent is paid, and dealing with mutual exchanges, offering general advice, visiting people in the homes. And then what we've called a sustainability housing management officer role, which again works more intensively with people who've been tenants for some time and maybe need some extra support to keep to get them back on track. And that might be around health issues, antisocial behaviour, rent arrears issues, or a combination of all of the above as well. And those roles, those intensive roles at the start and during the tenancy, are very much about providing extra support, almost acting as a key worker, linking in with and making sure that other appropriate support, whether it be floating support or local area coordination, working with some of the housing navigators, for example, from the homeless prevention teams, are brought in. We wrap that support around people. We get them back on track and sustainable in their tenancy. So that's the model. We're 2 months into it now, January, February, and halfway through March. So we're 2 and a bit months into it now. The initial feedback, you probably want to ask me some questions about it, so I won't go into it at this stage. But obviously, going forward, what we'll be doing is gathering feedback from counsellors, from partners, from the staff themselves, and from customers, more importantly, about the experience that they have had and how it's working. I will say initial feedback is positive from the teams. It's tough. Housing management generally, regardless of the model, is a tough job to do at the moment, given the environment that everybody has to exist in at present. So that's my summary, and I'm more than happy to take questions.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Councillor Fitzpatrick in first, because I know you're on a time scale, and you raised a point in the last discussion around the linkage with children's services. So I'll give you the opportunity to ask your question.
Thank you. I wasn't actually going to ask you that to start with, Dennis. I was going to come back to what we talked about at the last meeting, really, and resettlements, and talking here about who the role of the introductory tenancy HMO. There's still a lot of confusion out there in the community. I can think of 3 situations in my own ward at the moment where other neighbours of people who are not receiving support in terms of resettlement or knowing who to contact in terms of HMO. Do you think that is all going to be, it's teething problems there and that will get better? Is that the answer kind of thing to that? Because it is problematic at the moment. People are not being supported sufficiently on that level. And whereas before they knew who to go to, Councillor Cragill and I will know, we might say Eloise, for example, that's changed now. People don't know, they're not clear. They'll become clearer.
Yes, absolutely. And again, that's some of the feedback that we need to take on board and work through. So how do we develop ways that it's easy for everybody to find out who their specific housing management officer is? As I mentioned previously, the idea of creating that individual role in the last structure was exactly in response to, I want one person to deal with, and that's the end of it. So there's always a compromise in anything that we do, and I think that's one of the compromises that we have. I think the response will be a range of issues, so as well as using the housing portal that we have with open housing, where people can find out who the housing management officer is. We'll need to develop that so it's more sophisticated. Consistently reminding people of who their housing officer is. It does complicate matters when people need to know who it is, but we're always on the end of the phone. There's always somebody who can give you that advice as well. And in addition to that, we have things like advice sessions as well, so that people can sort of drop in and discuss matters generally across the city. We have those. So absolutely, that's the sort of area that we will want some feedback on, and we'll generate ideas through those discussions about how we can address that better. But I don't think there's ever going to be an absolutely perfect situation. I think even when we had the single roles, people change roles periodically, and any change that you do will inject a bit of chaos into the system where people are catching up with who their new housing management officer is as well. So
okay, right, yes, please.
Following on from the last meeting again, where we're talking about Safe York Partnership, and we hear multi-agency mentioned a lot. That, I suppose what I'm saying is, in terms of resettlement and tenants that have difficulties moving into blocks where maybe there are settled people there, all of that is still going to operate, or you're going to be working closely with other agencies to support, to make this work.
Yes,
and again, bringing children maybe in there as well, looking at them.
Yeah, so with resettlement, whenever, for example, we do a housing first, I sign those off personally, and I get to see the levels of support around people. I get to see the history, I get to see the particular issues, and I get to see that they're being addressed with an ongoing plan for support. And what will happen when that doesn't work? So there are specific cases where some of the most vulnerable people coming through have a lot of scrutiny around, and it's not scrutiny for scrutiny's sake. It's to make sure that we are going to give them the best opportunity to succeed in that tenancy. We've got a huge success rate with Housing First in particular, so that is working. We will, as far as we can, adopt that with other people coming through you know, our resettlement routes, and through the homelessness route as well. So some of my team are working on a pre-tenancy induction programme for residents coming through those routes. So the teams at James House in particular and my team have been working together about the sorts of things that people might need. And obviously we'll make that as bespoke as possible, and get to try and get as individual as we can on that. But there will be some basic stuff that we will need to make people aware of generally. So there's that as well. And obviously people just applying to the housing register, you know, that aren't sort of already within our accommodation. That's a little bit more difficult. So what we'll do is try and make as much contact with them as possible and get them set up for that tenancy as well. But we're still in the early days of that, and we're developing our approach around that. But that's the definite aim. With regard to children, so you will be aware that I'm on things like the corporate parenting board. We're responding to the recommendations around youth homelessness as well. So we're just in the process of finalising a protocol around that. We're looking at whether our Household for Young People facility needs registration with Ofsted as part of their new regime around registering places for the young people are accommodated in. So we're working on a number of levels. Me involved in the senior management meeting and the reviews and the inspections that are going on, and obviously the ongoing day-to-day work on you know, it's at the coalface, as it were, with the staff. At corporate parenting board next week we will be bringing the housing protocol, which has involved young people in developing that, around what they can expect from the housing service in particular as part of the local offer for young people with experience of care. So there's an awful lot going on across the board as well. It's not perfect, and again, it probably never will be perfect. You know, we've got a commitment, for example, to provide some more trainer flats for young people so that we become tenancy ready. That service, the pathway service, don't have enough resources to be able to staff that as yet. So we'll work together to try and get more of those properties up. But you know, again, we need the resources to be able to make them work effectively.
Okay.
Yeah, John, to come back on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm pleased to hear that about children. I'm a bit concerned about the role of the LACs really in this new model now, because I know at the chalk face, to go back to my earlier examples, resettlement, whatever, they are taking on more of that kind of work now. And I just wonder, you know, I mean, within their job descriptions and things like that, is it the intention that they will be working like that alongside people who are being resettled and whatever as part of the team?
It is, and it has been for some time. So housing management well, housing services work extremely closely with the local area coordinators. I meet with Jenny, the team manager, on a regular basis, and I'm involved in their management team meetings as well. So I'm very well aware of the demands on that service, and in fact, just about every council service, to be honest with you, that we work with are under intense pressure with the resources that they have to keep delivering great services for people. We will continue to work realistically with each other to support people. We've got some great examples of where we've worked with the local area coordinators. In particular, we've got the early help funds that we share, which comes from the housing revenue account, and which is spent specifically on, obviously, on council tenants. And again, I'm seeing referrals from my team to that early help fund, working with local area coordinators, particularly around getting people set up in their tenancies. That will reap rewards further down the line. What we know is that probably the first 10 weeks of the tenancy and just before are the most crucial in setting that tenancy up and it becoming sustainable in the long term. If you don't put the effort in there, you will not reap the benefits further down the line. So again, this is about providing more of that support and getting people ready around that. And just again, an example with the local area coordinators, we meet from an operational perspective regularly as well. I think we met 2 weeks ago just to touch base about where we're at, what resources we have, what realistically referrals we can make. As with a lot of services, we could do with more of it. But
and just as a reminder that the switch to this model was away from a model that was a generic job description where every HMO had to deal with all of the specialist requirements and try and deal with the volume issues. And I think that was becoming increasingly untenable. It was either going one way, that you get sucked into the specialist issue because that's causing the most noise, and actually collecting the rent goes by the by, or you get caught up with the volume and you can't give enough attention to those important issues. This is an attempt to do with the same level of resource, a better response to those big challenges. And as Dan says, we could probably double the amount of resource we got in there and still have plenty to do. But again, it comes back to you can only spend this money once, and the amount of money we've got to spend on housing management as opposed to the repair services, it's coming out of the same pot.
Like, you know, it's good to have a good overview of those kind of interlinkages with other teams within, and I'm sure without the council as well. Just in terms of, I suppose, getting a sense of how the split has kind of panned out, it'd be helpful at some point if you could sort of share with members a breakdown of maybe in the 3 kind of housing areas that we use for organisational purposes, the number of people in each tenants in each category in terms of the introductory, the sustainability, and the business as usual as a category. I suppose just to have a sense of and obviously there'll be fluid category in terms of the numbers in each category, but if you could give some thought to that, that'd be just helpful to understand how that pans out.
yes, we can do that. That will be an integral part of the review and the ongoing review and assessment of how it's working.
Councillor Bassey.
Thank you, Chair. Well, what I've heard certainly gives me a sense that there's a great coherence in what is being done and putting into 3 different areas. I hope this doesn't sound petty, because it given all the good stuff that's going on, it might do. But when I look through these and I think about talking to residents and how people respond to council and local authorities, I have a very clear idea when I read introductory tenancy HMO. I know exactly what that means. And when I read community HMO, again, that means something to me. When I turn to sustainable tenancy HMO, it doesn't really mean much to me. And I suspect tenants might struggle. It's not that the content of what that team is doing isn't clear. It's very clear. It seems it's about managing conflict. It's about specialist support. It's about keeping people safe. It's about a whole load of very clear things. But I find myself wondering if going forwards beyond the pilot, in terms of the clients, in terms of residents, whether there might be a better name for that going forwards in the medium term, long term, so that people had a greater clarity when they read that name. And I'm not saying I know what that should be, but I've scribbled down living together or getting on together, because it seems to me that the focus is about that part of what you've been talking about. As I say, I'm hoping I'm not being petty, but I just think if I talk to residents, the word sustainability is so vague. It gets so easily mixed up with the environment and sometimes doesn't mean that at all. So that was my observation.
A more accurate use of the English language might be sustaining tenancies. And what we're trying to do with the vocabulary is not to be pejorative about the people are in this situation.
Yeah.
We don't want it to be a naughty step or a
Conflict
a
or-
badge of dishonor or whatever. It's got to be about helping them to sustain their own tenancies through helping them with managing the complexities of their lives. But I get your point that it can be used, sustainable can mean just about anything in any situation, can't it? We'll take a look at that. Maintaining might be better, yeah.
Just something that, yeah.
Yeah, Councillor Craighill.
Yeah, I'm just going, hang on. I was just going to go back briefly to, I think it was the first question Councillor Fitzpatrick asked about ward councillors being aware of who all these people are in some cases. You know, if you've got 2 different estates in your ward, or you might have more than that, and then some other people scattered around or split between different areas, and you've got your 3 different types of HMO as well. And it would be desirable if all ward councillors could be made aware of that. I appreciate it's complicated, so you're probably not going to like me for saying that, but I also noticed that you said open housing portal is where tenants can go to find out. So if you could train ward councillors or enable ward councillors to find out that way, that might be another thing to consider.
Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah. I would hesitate to provide lists of individual tenants who might be in any category.
No, I don't mean that.
Okay.
Yeah. Go on.
I don't mean that. I mean, just so every ward councillor, such as us for Guildhall, knows who are all our HMOs. You know, what are the 3 different types of HMOs?
Yeah,
There are
not
different
not
areas.
having information on who
Not
which
on
tenants.
tenants.
We've
on
got
HMOs.
information that tells us who makes
I know you've got
which
it,
area,
you
so
sent
we
me a
can.
great
Can we
spreadsheet. or
send that to
something,
members?
but-
Yeah.
Yeah, so there is, and I think I sent it round in the link that I sent out to councillors just prior to the pilot. There is information on the intranet, Colin, where that in the form of a multi-sheet, a spreadsheet, with loads and loads of very useful information on, including who the HMOs are. But again, you're absolutely right. The situation is complicated, and it will change. We can send out information and it can be out of date the next week. So what we try and do is update live information on there. So we can, again, as part of the ongoing review process, develop those tools so that people like councillors can easily access that information. I struggle with it, and I work in the team, so I have to constantly refer to those spreadsheets because there's 29 people to try and remember who covers what area.
Perhaps you could just resend the link to Scrutiny, and then you've got access to it.
Yeah,
and I think it for the new intake of councillors or returning councillors as part of the induction thing, it's like, right, housing, these are some of the key things you need to know. This is where you can find the information. Got Councillor Fitzpatrick and then Councillor Beck.
I just want to add to that, really. I suppose being a teacher and sort of an inspector, people learn in different ways. You know, there's different kinds of ways of doing it, kinesthetic or visual or whatever. So sometimes to just have links and lots of words and written down. A chart, to me, if I can see a flow chart, exactly who's who, whatever. So yeah, and it doesn't just relate to this. I think if we're talking about induction generally of councillors, just to have it sometimes a flow chart or clear for each ward. This is without having to read through lots and lots of closed print. I think, you know, even for adults, that can be quite. That's why, even though we had all the emails, Dennis, and I know they were very informative, I did ask last time, could you explain it to us? So thank you for doing that. That's a different way of learning, really, which is I prefer to hear you talk about it, but my preference personally is a chart, and we all learn differently and we all retain information differently. So Maybe for the training sessions we have for new councillors, just different ways of giving them information. I'd just like a chart I can pin on the wall at home, telling me things, basically.
Yeah.
This is who you contact for this, that and the other.
It is tricky, and I know I suppose there's always a risk that as soon as you print it off, it becomes obsolete. And you think, oh, they're not doing that anymore. And you can't win really. Councillor Baker.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, just out of interest, really, I wondered how those 29 people received this new model in general, and did you have to, when you were trying to appoint which of the existing staff did which role, did you interview people? Did people volunteer? And were there any challenges with allocating the right amounts of the 3 different types to the people that wanted a particular role or not?
Yeah, so I mean, whilst we looked at, as a management team, we looked at a range of models and best practice from around the world, let alone in the UK. We consulted heavily with staff on this to get to the point, and at some point you have to make a decision. Everybody's got an opinion about how things should be. We had to make a decision, which we did again in consultation with staff and the unions representing the staff as well. And then after that we said we're giving you the task of designing exactly how it's going to look on the ground. So rather than us, putting a model forward and it being a sort of fait accompli, we said these are the parameters, these are the big things. You need to go into the detail, and that's what they did. They really enjoyed their exercise. When it came to deciding on the roles, we asked for volunteers. We did say that we would look at people's individual skills, experience, etc. We were oversubscribed and people wanting to do these specialist roles. So we did have some informal discussions around, how they would work within those roles, and then we took decisions on who slotted into the roles as well. So we tried to be as democratic as we could about it in doing that, and I think we're reaping the benefits of that, because there's a lot of ownership within the teams about it, rather than a structure that is imposed on people. And the message is very clear. This is a pilot. We're hoping that it works. We think from what we've seen elsewhere, and certainly the early indications are that it's working. And when we started talking about this and designing it and planning it with teams, we were coming out of COVID, and then we've gone into a cost of living crisis, which has put, additional and different pressures on the teams as well. And despite all of that, they've still been really enthusiastic about it. The thing that's part of the things that held us back on delivering it was getting the IT right for them. But we knew from experience, if we didn't get the IT right to support people, it would be less likely to be a smooth transition from the old structure into the pilot structure. And having put the time and the effort in doing that, it's been a much more smooth transition than we've experienced in previous restructures, where we've maybe started running before we could crawl, to be honest with you. So yeah, they're still really enthusiastic about it. I think it is reaping rewards. I think I've mentioned a few cases where we're seeing, behavioural changes within the teams, and focusing more on the individual needs of families and individual tenants as well. And I just actually come across an email where, which I don't think is entirely unrelated, around our rent arrears. So in addition to that, within the pilot, we've had a real focus on rent arrears as well within that. And in the work that we do, it's about supporting people, getting as much advice to them as possible, and supporting them to be able to pay the rent. So that's looking at them holistically as individuals and families, and getting the right support in place. And, we've, over the last month, we've seen a reduction of £40,000 in the rent arrears, which is music to my ears. Whether we can sustain that performance in the long run, remains to be seen. but certainly I have seen, I get copied into emails where individual members of staff are being praised for their performance around rent arrears in particular. And I noticed that one of them had managed to reduce rent arrears by £12,000 on their own individual patch, which is, you know, some performance in the current environment. And I think that is really about the change in culture that we've seen over time, and which has taken a leap forward within this pilot, to be honest with you.
And the jobs that the team do, hats off to every single one of them. They're not easy jobs at all. You mentioned it. It's what they can face in a working day is very, very broad.
Yeah.
And they do it with great energy and with great skill. So, you know, I tip my hat to the whole team and the way in which they've embraced this pilot and actually got on board with that slightly softer process about how to do it than we normally take. I think it's worked wonders. I think it's a massively positive way of trialing new ways of working, seeing whether it works before you formalise it and then moving forward.
Yeah, I think it, you know, hopefully some of the learnings from it can be shared across the organisation in terms of if you find yourself with a staff team who are motivated, yes, sort of stretched in terms of the volume and nature of the work, but I'm sure that there may be other teams in the council who think, well, you know, that's an interesting approach. Maybe we can look to learn from that. So yeah, certainly do, and I'm sure you will talk about it with colleagues. But yeah, please do.
We're more than happy to share success stories.
Excellent. Any other questions from members on that paper? No. Thank you very much. There is no urgent business I'm aware of. So I'd just like to say thank you to members who've been on this committee for the last 4 years, to officers who've come along to this committee, those who are here now, those who are not. And just to say a thank you to the late Tom Britton, who I think was our first head of housing services when I took over chairing the committee, and was certainly very helpful and very candid, was Tom in all of my discussions with him. And that was, which I appreciated because, yeah, nothing was ever kind of sugar-coated. And I think that's been a refreshing aspect of this committee, in that officers have answered questions when they can. Where they can't answer it, they'll tell us they can't answer it rather than fob us off, which is always good. Yeah, and I've enjoyed it. I hope members have found it an interesting and useful committee. We've achieved a bit. I'd like to have done more, but then wouldn't we all in the course of our council and other lives? But thank you very much for your support and your assistance.
And can I also say, Chair, a thank you to you, who I think has chaired this committee with great fairness, preparation and diligence, and I think we have been a successful committee. I think we've asked good questions. We've scrutinised and criticised where we've needed to, and I think we've also been constructive in support. And certainly, if you could pass our thanks on to all the officers that have been here tonight, but also in previous months and years, and all the teams that you manage, that we are very grateful for all the work that you've done and they've done.
Yeah.
And we may see you, so some of us may see you, and those members that are standing down, thank you for your time. But we may be back in a few months' time to make your lives even more miserable.
I agree with the
fulfilled, yes. Sorry, I
agree with
meant
the
to say
comments
fulfilled.
you've all made about the value of the scrutiny committee, because it's, I mean, I've got quite a few scrutiny committees that I attend, and this has been the most bipartisan, and it's been the most constructive and discursive of those. Takes quite a lot of time, but on which note, I've got to go.
Okay. Thank you very much, and good night.